point here and just kind of explore it. Alan mentioned opinion. I remember growing up on the farm in Illinois. My father was a Democrat committeeman and active in Democrat politics, and he'd go to the mailbox and bring back the paper, which was the Danville Commercial News, and he'd be waving it all the way back up the driveway and saying, "This blankety blank Republican newspaper." And I still remember that as though it happened yesterday. And we had a period in this century where the press was very partisan, very adversarial, very representing a particular spectrum, and that has largely in a way melted away. It's my impression, as whether because of the market or because of the press. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you're absolutely right. Just the facts newspaper is about 50, 60 years old, not much more than that. There were a number of years. I mean, people talk about the newspapers, and the founding fathers would never have wanted the kind of newspaper I worked for. Well, indeed, they would think we were pussies. The press was virulent and taking sides back in at the time of the founding of the country. And then what happened was there was a democratization that came about with the penny press in the mid-19th century, where everybody could have a voice. Well, one of the ways that changed things was the penny press was saying, well, we're going to tell you the truth. You know, they're the Democrat papers and the Whig papers and the Republican papers, and we're going to tell the truth. And that evolved into, you know, maybe 50, 60 years later, into the corporate ownership, which came about, in the early part of the late 19th century, early 20th century, with Hearst and Scripps Howard and a number of others, and later Gannett and New York Times and Knight and Ritter. And you know, they were in the business of not offending anybody, particularly advertisers. So they played it very straight. The news accounts were, you know, as far as possible, just accounts of what happened, and they left opinion to the opinion pages. And in many cases, they're kind of squishy too. But you know, it has changed. Yeah. But you know, people who think that the press in this country has always been fair and honest and upfront, that's just a lot of baloney.
Tammy, any thoughts?
Well, I think that ownership of the media has had an extraordinary effect on how virulently people take positions in communities, and sometimes that ownership factor has been good, and sometimes it's been bad. Sometimes it may have in a global sense have had the impact of diluting strong opinions. But on the other hand, I think that you know, as a reader, if you're a newspaper reader, or if you're a person who wants information and news and opinions, there's no right way or wrong way. I mean, for this to be done, and that's a good thing. You want to be informed. You need to probably go to multiple outlets and sources, and also very much listen to that other side of the opinion paradigm, if you will, and that's kind of the as they refer to, the general unwashed public. You know, what the real people in the street are saying, because sometimes they're the ones with the opinions that count.
Alan, anything you want to kind of layer on this?
Yeah, two things. On the print side, I think that the degree of the ideological flavor of the paper is directly related to how many papers there were in the town. When you had 5 or 6, you could afford to have more that reflected different slivers of the ideological spectrum. I think as you got more and more to 1 and 2 newspaper towns, the resulting papers found the need to kind of homogenize things, in some cases because they absorbed another paper. On the broadcast side, I think on the radio side, you've seen now niche talk more or less reverting back to the early days of the American Republic when, as we heard, newspapers were far more ideologically polarizing and far more vehement than they are today. And that's what you see in talk radio. And then when you have, which by the way we don't consider ourselves to be, we're more news than talk, but for the stations they are mostly talk. And that is why you have listeners that identify so closely with them, and they end up assailing the daily press, because to them the stations much more reflect their point of view and where they are than the daily press does.
Let me go on. I mean, 2 of our most popular columnists are 2 of the most ideological. Bill Press, the liberal, and Cal Thomas, the conservative. I mean, they don't make any bones about it. They see an issue. They both could see an issue, and Cal would write it one way, and Bill Press would write it the other. And the people who like Bill Press hate Cal Thomas, and vice versa. because people tend to read Cal Times because he tells them what they want to hear. Same with press.
Let me kind of explore one more issue here real quick, and then we're going to move on to some questions. If any of you have any questions, let me ask you to feel free to come up to this microphone. Be prepared to just state your name if you'd like, and any area that you'd like to either raise a question of our panel or add to the debate. So please feel free to do that as I pose this last question. John, we touched briefly on kind of the role of the DuPonts early in the century, and to the extent we have aspirations of looking at the century, one of the things that really impacts the press in any community are the institutions. And it's hard to imagine an institution that's been more pervasive throughout most of the century in Delaware than the DuPont family and the DuPont company, although certainly in the last decade that's been matched by, if not eclipsed by, the banking industry. Downstate, Tammy, arguably we'd talk about agriculture having been the dominant paradigm, although arguably we could take a look at how tourism and other kinds of economic development are replacing that. But I'm interested in how our particular institutional things like the DuPont family or banking you feel may have impacted our press, either through ownership or through influencing coverage.
Well, it's no big secret that DuPont Company, owned the News Journal and did to some extent influence how it operated. But it loosed its grip in a lot of cases. I mean, they were mostly interested in the editorial pages, and at least in my experience, when I first started there, before I was on the editorial pages, I mean, they didn't much care what Dixie Sanger and John Craig did or said in editorials all year long. But when it came early November, they were going to endorse Republicans no matter what. That was it. Endorse our people that are going to further our interests. Well, I don't have a big problem with that. I mean, the voice of the newspaper is its editorial pages, and the guy who signs the check gets to say what's on there. If you own the newspaper, you get to say what there's no freedom of the press. That's a lot of baloney. A.J. Liebling, one of the great press critics, said, there's freedom of the press for anybody that owns one. The difference today is that with the internet, anybody can own one, and you can say what you want, and if you don't like what's being said in the News Journal or the Delaware State News, then go do your own newspaper and print it up.
Have the banks
distribute it and see whether you can sell it or not.
Have the banks, in a sense, become an influential institution in journalism?
Well, anybody that employs 30,000 people is going to have an impact on what newspapers cover. I mean, we cover Bear and Glasgow now. Guess what? All those people work for the banks.
Yeah.
I mean, the impact is not necessarily direct. It's we cover the people.
Tammy, any thoughts from you?
Well, just kind of a different way of looking at the impact of the DuPont family, not so much on ownership, but the fact that they were and have been and continue to be players in a small state is going to drive some editorial decisions. They built schools, they built roads, and many of them are still active, and some of them are notorious in the news. And Pete DuPont, for example, has gone off and started his own online publication. He's a former governor of Delaware. Obviously, he's somebody that even today, when he talks, people still listen, pay attention. We run his column occasionally. I think we had one either yesterday or today. So if you want to look at an institution, I don't know that you'll ever, or at least not for the next generation, be able to easily separate that name from issues and news interests in Delaware, because they've had a tremendous impact.
What about the shifting paradigm downstate between agriculture as an influential industry and maybe moving to tourism and economic development kinds of interests?
I think that's a big topic. It's going to be for a long time, and it's from a news standpoint, it certainly is interesting. It's provocative. I think it is at times even cataclysmic because of you've got some real tough issues, and again, I don't know that there are either or decisions. It's a matter of from a journalistic standpoint, giving people the information that they need so they can make intelligent decisions about what they want in their communities, and the communities are changing, the dynamics.
Alan?
My only comment would be you tend to, of course, cover the concerns of your readers, your listeners, your viewers. And if readers, viewers, or listeners are disproportionately employed by one particular industry, you're going to be covering a lot of that from the vantage point of how that industry is evolving and what it will take to go to yet another level. In that sense, then, there are going to be some views that don't get reflected in a particular area. I'm always fascinated when I hear on talk show hosts and people say they can't understand the Congress, those awful Congress people, but they love their local member of Congress. And I think it just reflects the fact that although we are in many ways a homogeneous country today, there are vast differences. And you don't realize it until you've moved around the country a little bit. And indeed, the interests in Oklahoma or Montana and Delaware are vastly different. And although we all try to be objective and we do try to reflect varying points of view, truly there are going to be viewpoints that don't get on with great regularity from one part of the country to the other. And that's what I find fascinating for the few times that I've been able to work in other parts of the country.
As we head into the last 15 or 20 minutes before wrapping up, let me ask if any of the folks in our audience have any questions they'd like to pose. Don't be shy. This is, you can see that this is not a panel that is embedded in reticence. So don't be shy if you'd like to even raise your, sure, go ahead. All right, go ahead and go ahead and shout it out and I'll repeat it.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to throw out a name of a Delaware media legend who's probably in many cases unknown and certainly unappreciated in his own time, which is right now. And that's Ray Robinson, who was the founder of the Secret Leader newspaper and still writes a column for that newspaper today. He is a legend in community journalism, true community journalism, because he still writes about his own hometown, where he's lived his whole life, and he's in his late 80s or early 90s.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, and it's interesting that as we focus on print in our society and even broadcast, that one of the areas that we probably that suffers because we pay less attention to it is what we would call the community press or the weekly press. And certainly we have 2 or 3 leaders, one of whom you heard this morning, in addition to Mr. Robinson, Jim Flood, who has done a tremendous job of, is Jim here? Oh, back here. Hi. Hey, I can't see in the shadows, Jim, but Jim Flood, who 25 years ago started his own weekly newspaper here in Dover, the Dover Post, and has since grown that into a significant holding of community papers. And we have the ones upstate, the Community News, and a few others. So certainly, in a lot of ways, the weekly press is alive and well and healthy.
Although there's an article in the American Journalism Review just out about the demise of community journalism. It's a kind of a scary thing. I think it's true here in Delaware. Jim's papers, the newspapers that Independent News controls, they're still reflecting their communities, but and they're very profitable. And that's why some of the big companies are moving to buy weekly newspapers and just do to them what Alan described the large corporations doing to community radio stations. You get rid of half the people. You don't worry about much in the way of local. You just provide sort of an homogenous kind of journalism, and it's a kind of a scary thing.
Any other questions or comments?
If I could make
Sir?
a comment, I read the same article, and while it ended up on a negative note, Peter Wagner, one of the people who does have a very successful weekly, made the point that he thinks that the situation is one in which there are opportunities for weekly papers.
Yes.
I'll tell you frankly, we're going to be around for a long time.
Oh, I think so too, Jim.
Well, let me take that question as a question for our panel before we move into the kind of the next level of questions, and say, how do you see the role of the weekly press changing? Where's it been in Delaware, and where do you see it going?
Well, I think it's been a lively alternative to the dailies. They've led the way for people like us. When we're looking to secure readership, what have we done? We've created weeklies and gone to zoned publication. The weeklies have been doing that's what they do. That's their bread and butter. They cover the local. And I think part of that article, Jim, was that that's what's happening. The big newspapers are recognizing, in many cases, that they can't directly compete with the weeklies because they just can't get that small.
And I don't think that they should compete. I think that they serve very different needs. I think weekly newspapers, at least in in the present, and we're going to talk about the internet in a minute. I think that affects a lot of things, but I think weekly newspapers are usually and should be intensely local. They really examine and report and reflect their community at a microscopic level, and that's a role that is needed, necessary, and appropriate. And I think that daily newspapers and weeklies are complementary of one another and should be. You know, oftentimes you talk about competition between the two, and frankly, and we see that in our own company. Some of our people say, well, you know, we work for the daily and we work for the weekly, and so there's a clash. But I'm not so sure that makes sense from a readership standpoint. Again, things don't have to be either or, black or white, a right way or a wrong way. It's alternatives, it's choices, so that people can choose what they need when they need it, rather than being dictated to by one entity.
Let me, if I can, before we start to move towards closure with some discussions of the future, ask specifically about your view of the role of the press in impacting a couple of really issues that we've touched on, and issues that touch all of us. One of those is politics in the press. The other is the whole issue of race, segregation, desegregation, and so on, which arguably has been one of the single biggest stories of the last half century. What, we're sitting here where conceivably the biggest political story of the last 25 years is the one that's going to occur next year when Governor Carper challenges Senator Roth. But when you look at the role of the press in politics, any thoughts, any observations about the impact, the change, what press in Delaware has brought to public policy and to governance?
Well, I think that the press does have a role in public policy, and if not governance. I think that, and this, talk about getting into some things, at least in the profession, getting into areas of public journalism or civic journalism, where the press, the media, whether it embraces certainly broadcast, leads the way, challenges its public to consider certain issues. We at the News Journal, we've done a few of these issues on infant mortality, economic development, on education, and then last year the latest one we did was on race. And it's a sort of a two-part thing. The news department does its reporting. I jump in at the other end because there's no question of my being impartial. I'm not impartial. I mean, every single day people know what I think. So that that's a role that I can bring to it and help to challenge the community on these issues. And I often partner with some other groups in the state. What I say is we rent a hall, buy lunch, and invite people to come and talk about some of these serious issues. And I think that the remarkable thing here in Delaware is that every time we've done that, we've had 500 or 600 people come to talk about infant mortality, about race, about economic development. And I think that's splendid, and I think that's a role that all newspapers and broadcast operations ought to have, as to be the catalyst, to be the challenger.
I would take us a little bit, put a little twist on that, and I think that my view would be that the role of the media, I'm going to talk about newspapers mostly for a moment, is to provide that challenge. But I don't know so much that I would say we lead the way. I think that it's incumbent upon the media to be really good listeners and let sometimes the community lead the way, because there's been an awful lot of research in kind of why people are disengaging from public debate and public discussion, and most often it is because people don't feel that they can have an impact. And so I think that what we need to do in the media is concentrate more on re-engaging the public and stepping back, being a little bit better at stepping back and letting people in the community, sometimes not necessarily the power brokers, help to identify and then lead the discussion about issues. And then, maybe our role is more to facilitate and to make sure that all the voices, including the ones that are not necessarily very popular, are heard and aired, because opinions and ideas can't really hurt anybody. In fact, oftentimes it's not getting them out is what causes the problem. I think that one of the things that we're guilty of as an institution is we don't listen. We are reactive rather than proactive. And the last place we should be looking to for leadership on issues in terms of what should be covered really is government. And I say that because government is very reactive. Government is responding and reacting to issues of the moment or trying to kind of fill in the void. And when you see, in my opinion, when you see government reacting and responding or acting, they're actually reacting to something that has been out there, a concern or an issue in the community for a very long time. So if there's anything that we might want to get better at, it might be listening more to the people on the street.
In fact, those forums that I just talked about,
I know.
That's essentially what they were. They were saying, government's telling you this or somebody's telling you that. You know, these are issues that, through some research, we've determined is on people's minds. And we say, come on down and talk about it. Let's find some, you all find some solutions. I mean, once we get people in the hall, we move back.
Alan, anything you'd like to add?
I'll be a little contrarian about it, I guess just basically because of radio research. I know that there's a percentage of people, for example, that will never listen to news on the radio, period. Never. I mean never. And these people may indeed ingest some news from television, but there's a percentage of Americans who just plain are allergic to news of any kind. You can try to make it as relevant as you want. Some people say, well, that's because in the absence of war, Great Depression, Great Calamity, we tend to isolate ourselves. And that's true. There's a percentage of people, they do their jobs, they go home, they're with their families, and unless it's construction around the corner, local news, something involving transportation or crime, there really isn't very much of that. There's also a massive gender gap, we know, in news between male and female. I mean, clearly women are less interested in news, or at the very least less interested in the news the way it's typically delivered to the media. I'll make that point. And I know in my business, for example, the only way that talk stations typically get more women than men are doing topics that hard journalists would probably roll their noses up in contempt. It's a real problem in my business. I mean, just this perception that women, especially younger women, are just unobtainable, just period, unobtainable, won't go to a community forum, won't do any of that. It's just not part of that universe. I'm generalizing and I'm stereotyping, of course. There are exceptions, but that's a basic reality. The problem that we face in news radio and talk radio, for example, is selling to advertisers who are trying to reach younger demos. They won't buy us because they're saying, well, you're not reaching the person who is trying to go to that store and pick up the latest fashion.
At our forums is that isn't true. And maybe we just touched on some topics that people did care about, but I mean, we had to turn people away, and there were plenty of women, plenty of men, plenty of business leaders, plenty of students.
Although, John,
they were there. Sam was intimately involved in the.
And my answer to you, and I'm going to be a little contrarian, but I think we're supposed to enliven this group. That's like Alan Keyes running around saying he's getting big crowds. I'm very. Don't misunderstand. I love your forums. It's one of the reasons why I envy folks in print, because you just certainly have a greater organizational structure to pull something like that off. But nonetheless, you're getting the people, I think, who are in some way activated. And all I'm suggesting is we got to remember there's this vast percentage that really don't move anywhere. And they may be turned off by government. They're turned off by a lot of other things too. They're in their lives, and that's the reality.